Today, I want to cover the general nature and purpose of education. The second will be teaching thinking methods, how to teach the student to think. Third will be what is a proper curriculum, what subjects should a child be taught. And fourth will be several related subjects on teachers and teaching. What methods technically should teachers use to be effective? How should teachers be trained? And what kind of political system makes possible good teachers? You can guess my answer to that one. Now, at the outset of this course on philosophy of education, it is necessary to motivate you. But I cannot do that until we get some preliminary idea of what education and the philosophy of education is. So I'm going to plunge in for a moment with a very general definition of education. And this definition is deliberately philosophically neutral at this point. This is a very exact parallel to what you do when you're starting ethics. You know that Ayn Rand began her ethics with a general definition of value as that which one acts to gain and or keep, which doesn't yet give a specific content. It doesn't say life is a value or reason is a value. It's the very general concept. And then by an analysis of that concept and the metaphysics and epistemology that underlies it, she infers that reason and life and so on are the values. Well, in the same way, we're going to start with education, a non-controversial general definition just to orient us to what this field is. And after due meditation, I have come up with the following. I submit it as essentially correct, although perhaps not as literarily felicitous as is possible. Education is systematic instruction of the young. You may as well take this down if you're taking anything down. To develop in them the powers necessary for mature life. Systematic instruction of the young to develop in them the powers necessary for mature life. This is basically obtained by raiding several good dictionaries. Now, a few notes on the wording of this, since that's going to be where we start. The word systematic is meant to indicate that to qualify as education, a process must be deliberate, organized, and long range. It's a process of years that takes place in steps or stages aimed at a definite result. Education does not signify haphazard, short-range accumulation of snippets of data. If you let a child loose in the jungle, assuming he could survive, he would undoubtedly learn a fair amount of information, the way wolf boys, for instance, do. But it would be scattered, disorganized concrete. That is not education. Education is a long-term, organized process. In that sense, there's a parallel to science. A lot of people can learn individual pieces of information, but it's science when you have systematic knowledge acquired through reason as against random pieces of data. The point here is that any major human undertaking has to be organized, purposeful, and systematic if it's to achieve its goals, and education is an essential of human life. In that sense, it's contrasted to the need of animals. Animals get tips from their parents, but they get them briefly, in no special order, and then they're thrown out of the nest to do it on their own. They do not have an education as we are here using it. Education is a human need, distinctively human, which is already a clue to something about it. Now, don't confuse education with schooling. It's possible to be educated at home, and there are authorities who think that it's even preferable. That is a different question, where you get it. Education does not even necessarily equal learning from others. There is such a phenomenon as an autodidact. You know what that is? Self-educated individual. Now, this is rare and extraordinarily difficult. In the typical case, a person gets usually some teaching from others and then finishes the job himself. But that also comes within the concept of education. So what we're focusing on, the broad essence of education, wherever it's given, whether by parents, teachers, or in part at least by yourself to yourself. That's systematic instruction. But adult education is typically remedial. In other words, the adults never got as youngsters from today's schools what they needed, so they're busy catching up, or at least trying to catch up, what is really a need of their youth. So it still comes under the general idea that education is in need of the young. There is also, I may say, for adults, such a thing as learning a specialized skill or a specialized body of knowledge. For instance, you want to go on a trip to Spain, so you learn Spanish, and that is commonly called education. It's really not education in the basic sense that we're concerned with. It's training in a concrete skill. But you can say, in effect, it's a continuation of the educational process that preceded it. In a sense, all learning is an extension of the youthful process of learning, so you can say education can go on all your life, because you can go on learning. But as I'm using it, education in the crucial sense is, what do you need to function maturely as an adult? Now, we said it is systematic instruction of the young to develop powers. Powers, sometimes people put in that powers and habits. Now, we want to stress here by that term the distinction between a specific concrete skill or piece of information on the one hand and education in general on the other. Education is concerned with developing general powers. Education goes to the essence of the child. If you take a typing course and become a proficient typist, that is not an education. It may be part of one. And here we can give a parallel between ethics and etiquette. An etiquette course gives you concretes, how to hold a fork and how to hold a knife, and it has a very circumscribed application to, let us say, dining etiquette, to eating dinner. An ethics course gives you advice and principles on how to live your entire life across the board in every situation. It's concerned with the fundamentals that shape your whole existence. Now, education in that sense is a parallel to ethics, not to etiquette. When we have 10 or 20 years in school, taking a whole variety of courses, the purpose has to be to bring out general abilities, powers, capacities, aptitudes for all of life. The purpose is to transform the child in many ways into a different being, to make as part of his makeup new capacities and powers that he didn't have before. The idea of education is take a tabula rasa, someone born blank, and turn him by a systematic process across years into a being with the skills and aptitudes necessary to fit him for adult life. That's just our beginning linguistic analysis, so to speak. Now, this, of course, raises many questions. Systematic instruction, I said. Well, what kind of instruction? In what? I said to develop the powers. What powers? What powers are necessary to mature life? And how can they be imparted? By what means? What is mature life? What kind of demands does it make on us? You see it at once, I think, how philosophy enters the picture here. Because all of these questions can be answered only by reference to a philosophy. In particular, for the philosophy of education, you need two critical subjects, epistemology and ethics. Epistemology, because you have to know how the mind operates, how it learns, how man, including the child, knows. That is the absolute precondition for any discussion of how to train it, how to impart new knowledge or powers to it. If you hold that reason is man's only means of knowledge, or you hold that faith is an essential means of knowledge, those two different theories of epistemology will have the most radical effects on your theory of education, how to communicate to a child, what to communicate to a child. The same is true if you hold that man can acquire certainty or you hold that he cannot. That's purely an epistemological question, but it will redound throughout every aspect of education. As far as the role of ethics, well, what does mature life consist of? What do we want to prepare the child for? Is it social adaptation? Self-expression? What? What is it that counts? What's important? What is worthwhile in life that the child has to learn to aim at, appreciate, cope with, as against what is dispensable, insignificant, or positively harmful. This is obviously dictated by ethics. So you can say that a philosophy of education is really nothing but the application of epistemology and ethics to issues of education. The whole field can be approached only from a philosophic basis, and once you have that basis, I don't think it's very difficult to figure out what to do in education. Now, the whole thing is the viewpoint, the philosophy, but I'm taking that for granted in this course, so it's going to be a breeze. All right, now with that brief intro, let me say a word to motivate you to take this course. You're ready here, but even so, you'll see next time why I think it's important to do this. If you are a teacher, it should be obvious why this course is of value to you. This is your life work, training children in something. Hopefully you want to know in what and why, for what purpose. If a teacher is anything other than the lowest hack, it is essential that he or she have this knowledge. Otherwise, they're like a sculptor with no idea of the object they desire or of the means of achieving it. And that is really beyond the pale. If you are a parent, it's pretty obvious, too, that this is crucial. Because you, the parent, are the one responsible for your child's maturation. You cannot just follow what the teacher says in any society, however perfect, but particularly today. You have to know, are they equipping my child properly or are they harming him? Are they giving him the essentials he needs to develop properly? Well, what are the essentials? If he's having trouble in school, is that his problem or is that the fault of the schools? Well, what are the schools doing and is that what they should be doing? A philosophy of education, in short, is essential to being a proper parent. Otherwise, you merely turn your child over to blind chance. And even if you happen to have good teachers, you have to supplement their work at home if the teachers are to have the full effect. So you have to know what you're after and how to cooperate with them. Now, I think the primary recipients or beneficiaries of a course on philosophy of education are these two categories: parents and teachers. In other words, those concerned directly with children. But there are two others that I think can benefit, which I hope will be enough to keep you motivated if you're neither a teacher nor a parent nor a potential parent. One is anybody who wants to communicate, to teach or persuade others of specific things, like a husband to a wife or vice versa, an employer to an employee, a speechmaker, a politician, and so on. Because part of the philosophy of education is the proper methods of teaching. And that's broadly applicable to anyone. And this course is going to be partly theory, but partly some practical tips and advice on communication or teaching. And from that point of view, hopefully anyone other than a hermit could benefit. Finally, I think you can benefit from this course even if you're not in any of these categories in the following way. It can provide you with a standard of self-evaluation. If you know a proper philosophy of education, you can look at yourself just privately within your own mind and say, well, how was I educated and how did I come out? Did my parents and teachers give me what I needed as a child for mature life? If not, can I supply the lack myself now? If you know the standard that man requires by his nature, presumably you can begin to judge your own case and remedy any deficiency you might observe. So it's like, in that sense, a philosophy of education is like a checklist in your own readiness to face the tasks of life as far as, training can equip you for that. Now, one last preliminary. Most of you, I'm sure by now, are used to me giving lectures on material that has either been written on by Ayn Rand or that I have discussed in great detail with her. So you're safe in assuming that she endorsed every word I would utter. That is not necessarily true of these lectures. Obviously, the philosophy, the pure philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics that I mentioned are standard objectivism. But the application to education is my own. I've had very little discussion through the years with Ayn Rand on this particular subject. I've had some, and I'll indicate to you when she has said certain things on it. But I don't want you to assume from the outset that this course is, so to speak, the word on this field. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe with the best will in the world I have inadvertently made a false application of objectivism. Clearly I don't think so. I believe I'm right, otherwise I wouldn't be standing up here presenting this material. But I don't want Ms. Rand saddled with the responsibility. You judge on your own. If what I say makes sense, fine. If not, come up with your own objections. I may very well be right to be converted on some point, within the limits of time. Your argument may have to be very condensed, but still. Now, let's go into the subject a bit. I gave you the analogy of first a general definition of value, and then ask, well, what is a value? What is the good? What fulfills this definition? And that's what we have to do now. To education. If education is instruction in the powers necessary for life, what powers for what kind of life? In other words, we have to give specific objectivist content. Otherwise, the thing is simply too broad to guide us in any direction. A proper theory of education, like a proper theory of ethics, has to tell you specifically how to function in this realm. It can't be just woozy floating abstractions. It has to tell you two things at least. How to instruct and in what. The method and the content. That's going to be our next two units. But if it doesn't tell you that or give you the means of figuring it out, it's worthless. It's just verbiage. Now I'm going to approach the objectivist view here by giving you 5 different theories of education. 5 different answers to the question, what in essence should education instruct us in for what purpose? And these, as far as I can tell, are the 5 most popular throughout the ages. And they have actually been accepted by schools, by centuries, by philosophers, in one form or another. And then I'm going to ask you to tell me how you evaluate these 5. Which one or which ones, if any, you agree with, which ones, if any, you disagree with. I want to stress that I'm giving these to you deliberately in random order. I'm not necessarily beginning with the best or the worst or the middle, and maybe they're all no good. First, just 5. And you'd give me, very tersely, an evaluation. First, the 5. Number 1, education is essentially the communication of factual knowledge. The communication of factual knowledge. The idea here is this. Men have accumulated vast amounts of information about reality. What they do now is organize it systematically and transmit it during the educational process. So basically this theory sees education as a process of giving youngsters vast amounts of information. The more, the better. They say, yes, we want to develop the powers necessary for mature life, and the power that's required is the power of cognition, they say. The essential of mature life, they say, is knowledge of reality. Therefore, the more we can give them, the better. After all, knowledge of reality is clearly a precondition of successful action. This is, in one way or another, the traditional classical view of education. Now notice that factual information here, factual knowledge, does not necessarily mean concretes only. It doesn't mean just making the kid memorize names and dates. It can include principles, for instance, principles of science or history or whatever. But the point is, cram the kid full of data. It can be organized, it can be logical, it can be principled, but give him as much as you can. The test of success is how much has he learned. Now I think you can see there's an obvious plausibility to this one. If you don't communicate knowledge, well, I'm not supposed to be making editorial comments here, but it's hard to figure out what else you could do if there's no knowledge. All right, second, in no order again. Education as essentially a means of socializing the child. Now, no hisses, please. This is the theory that the purpose of education is to train children in social adjustment, training them to become useful members of the group, the community, society. Now, depending upon the mental capacity of the advocate of this view, they will be broader or more specific. Some people take this theory in the form that the purpose of education is to train the children to fit into a classless society, or to become, quote, democratic in outlook, or to eradicate racial intolerance. And I've even heard that the purpose of all of education, this is from kindergarten on through graduate school, is to educate children in the skills necessary for energy independence. Now that's, fairly concrete bound approach. But one way or another, the idea behind all these versions is this, that the essence of life is one's relationship to other men. We don't live on a desert island, they say. Every value you want to achieve involves dealing with others. Every source of human happiness or fulfillment, whether it's work or love or you name it, involves relating to others. And this, therefore, is what the child must learn above all if he is to function successfully when he grows up. And this, therefore, is the task of education. Now, it's certainly true in some sense that you have to learn to relate to others. Which philosopher, by the way, is most prominently in this century associated with this particular view? John Dewey, right. All right, let's go to 3. We're just zipping through these. Number 3, education as a means of individuating the child. Individuating the child. Now this is the idea. The purpose of education is to enable a child to discover, realize, fulfill his own self. Behind this is the theory, every child is potentially unique. He's potentially an individual, and education should concentrate on bringing out this aspect of him, on stressing or fostering his individuality. The most crucial trait to bring out educationally, according to this theory, is independence. Train the child to stand on his own, by himself, not to count on or relate to others. Train him to discover and be completely independent. The advocates of this theory are very opposed to number 1, the factual knowledge theory, because they say that makes the child passive. He just sits there and absorbs all this data. He should be active. He should be an individual. He should do things as a personal, unique entity, not just sit there and have knowledge shoveled down his throat. And they say he should be creative, not just reactive to these gobs of data being poured at him. Now, the more intelligent advocates of this theory understand that you cannot teach creativity as such, because creativity means the discovery of the new, and if it was already known, you wouldn't be being creative. But their idea is that if you focus on developing the uniqueness of the child, creativity will spontaneously well up. Do you know any philosopher that's very famous today that advocated this particular theory? There's elements of this in Montessori, but not this. Well, I was going to say not this bad, but I can't evaluate it. Not that extreme. No, there's a philosopher already mentioned. And that's also John Dewey, for a reason you'll see in a moment. All right, number 4. Education as essentially a means of developing morality in the child. Now, there's many different terms. Instead of morality, you could say virtue, conscience, a sense of values, good character, good habits, proper pleasures, right emotions, mental health, if you're, on the psychological side, whatever. Some orientation of your psychology, your emotions, your behavioral side. And of course, the advocates of this theory may differ very strongly on what is morality, what is a good character. For instance, medieval religionists subscribed usually to this approach to education, and so in another way did Adolf Hitler. They had different ideas of what they wanted to turn out, but they both believed the purpose of the school was to bring up a certain kind of character in the child, and that it was not important whether he individuated himself or acquired knowledge, etc. The idea behind this theory is this: a child is born amoral. But moral character is critical to his development, his functioning, his happiness. He has to learn the right values. He has to learn the right emotions. That, after all, is what's going to shape all of his actions and his existence. And therefore, this is what education must focus on. Perhaps, they say, he won't learn a great deal of factual knowledge. But if you establish in him a good character, he's going to be safe for life, and then he can always learn on his own the particular data that he needs as and when the situation arises. Now, this is a very specific theory of education, even though it has to be conjoined with an ethics to yield a concrete content, because you have to say what is good character. But if you combine it with an ethics, you get a very specific theory of education. Who in today's world is not a philosopher, but a group, is most associated with this view? Yes? Well, the Catholic Church or the moral majority or the fundamentalists is generally associated with a religious group. They have definite ways of teaching, methods of teaching, and definite subject matter that they believe should be taught, all related to this theory of education conjoined with the religious morality. Now, finally, to continue and complete our zip through history, education as essentially training in... Now, if I wanted to kill time, I would ask you to suggest still another one. And you could make up dozens more, but this is the last of the big five. In methodology, specifically in the methodology of thinking, the method of reason, the method of using one's intelligence. Now, the advocates of this view say it's not important how much knowledge you give the child. It may even be harmful to give him a lot of knowledge. They say, concrete information he can always get later on his own, if only you do give him training in one thing: how to use his mind, how to use his intelligence, how to think critically. And the argument underlying it is very simple. How you use your mind, they say, determines whether your knowledge does you any good or not. If you don't have the right method, or you use it just sporadically, haphazardly, it's out of your control, your knowledge comes down to being just so much memorized dogma, so it's useless to you anyway. So what counts in life is not the content that you know, but the method, the training of your intelligence. Now, can you think of a philosopher associated with this one? Don't say Ayn Rand. A philosopher already mentioned, John Dewey, right. Now, you'll see shortly that that is not an unprincipled eclecticism on his part. On the contrary, it's perfectly consistent that he's for all those three. I shouldn't have said that because that gives you a clue. But now, there's the five main theories. Now, your first reaction may be, well, it's ridiculous to have to choose. Why can't we have all of them? You may say, I want my child to know something, and I want him to get along with others, and I want him to be an individual, and I want him to be moral, and I want him to think correctly, so why should I sit here and agonize which one of these to go for? Now, my answer to you is this. It is possible, perhaps, to combine a couple of these into some principle, but you can't have them all. Not in the point where we are now, because we are at the foundations here. We are at the foundations of the philosophy of education. And each of these dictates a whole system of education. We are looking for the primary in this field, the primary. Not just something that's good or desirable, but the root on which everything else is going to be built. And when you're on the level of primaries, you cannot choose everything. And there's a very important analogy here to Ayn Rand's argument, you know, as to why it's a disaster if you justify capitalism by saying it helps the poor. Even though it does help the poor. But if you make that the thrust of your argument, it implies that helping the poor is the standard of virtue. And if so, that means you have established the altruist morality as your ruling code. And if so, you're committed to collectivism, and that wipes out capitalism. Now, if you know anything of Ayn Rand's work, as I assume you must if you're here, you know the crucial difference between a primary and a secondary consequence, however desirable that secondary consequence may be. And that same issue applies here. Each of these 5 is offered as the primary. And as such, it would dictate the entire approach to education, both in method and in content. Now, take the socializing theory, for instance, which is obviously uncongenial to this audience, judging by your reaction. Everybody wants to socialize his child in some sense, not in the sense of turn him over to the government, but in the sense of teaching him to relate to others, to get along with them. But if that becomes a primary, if that is the principle which is going to guide you in your educational direction, that means you're saying relating to others precedes, is more important than training the mind or acquiring knowledge, etc. In other words, on that theory, the fundamental guide has to be fit into the group. That's the fundamental. And the whole education is planned accordingly. So, for instance, the theoreticians from this point of view think that the cardinal sin is to let the child ever do anything alone, because that inculcates bad habits in him. It weakens, deprecates, minimizes the crucial power that they are supposed to be strengthening and bringing out, namely relating to others. So they devise techniques deliberately to make education as social as possible. For instance, they'll learn only by group vote. And the whole group has to vote, and the child gets the idea, until the group has spoken, there is no truth. Or in kindergarten, when they're preconceptual, these type of schools have building blocks that are too heavy for one child to lift. So you can't even make a little, bridge or house by himself. He has to enlist 2 or 3 other kids, and the group makes a house, because it's simply physically beyond his power. Or in the later grades, 3 or 4, if they, for instance, they assign a biography, they want the kids to prepare an oral biography, they cut the data up into strips and give some data to one group and some to another, and no one group can do it until they search out who has the rest of the data, and only the class as a whole can come up with the biography. It's very creative, you see what I mean? If you hold this theory, there's an unlimited number of ways that they inculcate on every level. You're nothing by yourself. Du bist nicht, if you took Hitler's statement. Of course, dissenters from the group are squelched on principle on this type of approach because they don't fit in harmoniously. Generally, they preach you must never tell children that anything is an absolute. Why not? Because once they latch onto that idea, they're no longer malleable on that point, and if the group changes its mind, that'll set up conflict, and the whole crucial thing is to relate to the group. Now, you see just some of the disasters that follow simply from taking a perfectly desirable human trait, namely relating harmoniously to others, which any normal, rational person would want, but making it a primary. Now, take as another example of the same problem, if you made the individuating theory your primary. Now, objectivists, as you know, are all for individualism, independence, self-fulfillment, personal creativity. These are all words that set the juices flowing. And therefore, there are many objectivists who go for this theory all the time. Now, for instance, when I gave the Why Johnny Can't Think lecture some years back at Ford Hall, and I took some cracks against the individuating theory, and I was so bold as to say children should be seen and not heard in the classroom, I got quite a number, and I still periodically get outraged, angry missiles from objectivists saying I was betraying and so on and so on. Now, I will be discussing that a little more in detail in Lecture 4, my views on that. But just see, as a primary, if you took the purpose of education is to individuate the child, what would it lead to? And in a word, what would it lead to? Using a standard objectivist term. Exactly. It would lead to whim worship because it's individuality preceding knowledge, cognition, thought, reason. As a primary, it has to lead only to disaster. it really leads not to individualism, but to pseudo-individualism, because once the child is not being guided by reason, he's being guided by emotion. That means he loses his actual independence, which is his own judgment, and ends up accepting other people's value judgments, so he becomes a complete neurotic dependent. What does it lead to as educational theory? Well, I'll read you from an actual educational theoretician summarizing what this particular one leads to. The individuating view. In such a view, the classroom becomes the situation in which individuals may find facets of themselves. A problem that arises for discussion is not treated as a problem to be solved, but as an occasion for self-discovery. Each student is encouraged to conceive the problem in his own way, pursue it as he thinks best, and arrive at what is a terminus for him. The relative value of one or another formulation or one or another method of attacking the problem is not discussed, since the value of formulations and methods lies not in their effect on the inquiry, but in their potency as stimuli to the individual concerned. There therefore can be no specified intellectual aims of the curriculum. Inquiry is simply what each individual does. Truth is what he personally is able to accept. A sound solution is one that satisfies an individual at the time it is arrived at. The important thing is what rouses and marshals his energy. The trivial is whatever leaves him relatively unmoved. Now, there's plenty of schools, as you know, that follow that particular path. In other words, it leads directly to subjectivism. It has just as disastrous consequences as the socializing theory, because it's two different forms of undermining the student's mind. And this is why John Dewey was quite comfortable with both and could oscillate back and forth as he felt like. What about the others? What about the moral one? Should you educate children to be moral as a primary? I'll let you answer me in a sentence. No as a word, but that's a good word. Yeah. Why not? Well, it comes down to one simple thing, namely, morality is not a primary. Morality is a derivative. Philosophically, morality is a product of metaphysics and epistemology. In each person's life and psychology, his moral character is a product of his thinking, his knowledge, his value judgments. What would it mean to make morality a primary? Virtues are simply where you start. It means there's no validation. They come from nowhere. It means how do you know what's good or bad? You just accept it, right? Certain traits of character you just simply imitate from others. You simply obey. You do it because you're told. In other words, it's because morality is an issue of revelation. And that's why this theory is so often conjoined with the religious approach. Now, this is obviously inappropriate for the objectivist philosophy. The essence of morality for objectivism, anyway, is thinking. That's what all the other virtues derive from. So you could never accept a theory which makes good character as the primary. Now, that leaves us with the two most plausible of these candidates. 1 and 5 as our primary. Education as the communication of knowledge, education as teaching methodology. Each of these obviously has a very plausible claim. Who could say that knowledge is dispensable? Man survives by his awareness of reality. That's fundamental. He survives by learning what his predecessors knew and adding to it. So he has to learn what the context is when he's born in order to function at all. No one can derogate the transmission of knowledge accumulated so far. On the other hand, the method of thinking is also crucial. The method of using your mind is also crucial. Gobs of data is no good unless it's grasped by a thinking mind that knows how to understand, interpret, integrate, apply. And that needs training. It's not self-evident how to think. And that is essential to life. Reason, we say, as man's means of survival, and teaching the method of thought means really teaching reason. So you cannot choose between those two. Therefore, happily, I conclude you don't have to choose. Because properly understood, each of those implies and necessitates the other. These two are not like the other three theories, that you can separate them out as independent possibilities. If either is separated out from the other, then it's just as bad a disaster. It's only the proper understanding which combines those two which makes a proper educational principle. If you make it just knowledge by itself, that is very bad, because knowledge by itself without a child knowing the method means what? Dogma, revelation, blind memory. That's not knowledge. Now, everybody knows that much, but not everybody knows the other side, which I now want to stand on my head to emphasize. You cannot teach method by itself either. Never. Not at any point from grade 0 to grade 25. Method requires knowledge. I have to say that again. That's the only important thing from today's lecture. I mean, the one that involves me personally. Method requires knowledge. There is no way to teach the method of thought except on some content. Method as such is purely empty. Thinking means thinking about something. To teach method, you have to teach subject matter, facts, information, data, content, whatever is the most pejorative word in your mind for sheer cognition, just, the data of reality. An abundance of it, a wealth of it. You must cram it into the kit, otherwise the whole thing is a waste. But the point is, you have to teach it a certain way by a certain means. And the result is at the very same time as you are giving him knowledge, you are training him in method. To train in method, in my opinion, is nothing else but to present content in a certain way. Now, if you had to use one term for this, a philosophic fundamental, what one word, starting with an R, could you say? This is reality, the focus on reality, right? Give the child awareness of what's out there. And if you had to use one word, starting with an R, for this, what would it be? You're training the mind, you're training the intellectual power. Reason, right. Now this alternative is very simply the alternative of, should we give the child reality or should we give him reason? Now that is hopeless. Hopeless as a dichotomy. Either of them alone gets you nowhere. Reality, well, you don't understand that, because reason is your means of knowing reality. So if you divorce the two, you don't know reality and you're not being reasonable. Now, there is two schools of philosophy that will make this dichotomy intelligible to you. There is a school which holds that all we have to do to acquire knowledge is simply let reality act on us. It's not necessary to focus on our minds, our consciousness, our cognitive faculty, our reason. That's irrelevant. We just have to open our minds and something out there in reality will act on us and will produce knowledge in us while we passively sit back and wait. And therefore this school says it's a waste of time to bother teaching methodology. Just cram the kid full of data. And his mind is like a mirror. You just pour it in. What is that theory of cognition? The knowledge is simply a passive mind absorbing what reality thrusts on it. Intrinsicism, right. This is the theory of education that follows from intrinsicism. Now, I assume you know the intrinsic theory. I remind you in the very briefest terms, it simply says that all cognition is like sense perception. You don't have to have any special method to see this chair. You just sit here, open your eyes, and the chair acts on you, and that's it. You don't have to have validated. You don't have to motivate. You don't have to do anything. You just look at it, and it just writes itself on you. Now, it says all cognition is like that. Just sit the kids in class and put the equivalent of chairs in their head, and they just absorb it, and that is all. Now, what is the name? This is getting pretty easy now. What is the name of the theory that we should focus on? The development of our consciousness, the how, apart from worrying about reality. No, that's not epistemology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. There is a special theory of epistemology which says, don't worry about reality. Our province and all we have to concern ourselves with is how to operate your consciousness. What really counts is consciousness, not existence. What is that called? The subject, not the object, with an S. Subjectivism. That's the idea that you can train or develop or focus on your mental processes by themselves, apart from reference to the data of reality. Now that is the idea then of training minds, and to hell with reality. We're focusing on consciousness, and consciousness doesn't need existence. It's a self-contained world we can develop. Well, if you ask these people, well, what then should govern and determine how minds operate if it's not the data of reality? What do you think their answer is? Society. So that's this theory. Or your personal feelings. So that's this theory. And that's why John Dewey had no trouble combining all three of those theories, because the way he put it, having dropped out reality, they're all variants of the same thing. If you're not being guided by reality in training the mind, then it's just your feelings or somebody else's feelings. Now this dichotomy, the intrinsic versus the subjective, as you know, permeates our whole culture. You can find it everywhere corrupting a field, and it pervades the entire field of education and the philosophy of education. And if I had to say in the simplest terms, what is a proper theory of education? It will be neither. Neither the intrinsic nor the subjective approach. And we're going to be carrying that out throughout in all the topics that we discuss. I'm going to try to show you what the intrinsicist view would be, what the subjectivist view would be, where they have distinctive views, and then what the objectivist view is as against either. And you'll see how that affects the method of teaching, the nature of the curriculum, etc. And we're going to therefore use the term objective, or the objective approach to cognition, to stand for the one that is neither. Objectivity, as you know, to make a very condensed indication, means grasping reality somehow. Grasping reality by some specific human method. Using our consciousness in certain steps, according to certain rules, in order to discover the facts of reality. And that is what is the essence of a proper theory of education. So if you ask me, on an objective point of view, should we teach facts? Should we give factual knowledge to our students? Should we adulterate them by piling in data from reality? My answer is absolutely, unqualifiedly yes. An abundance of factual information. Should we wait for later? Absolutely no. Now is the time. What possible logic can there be to wait till he's 68 and say, now's the time to study reality because you've acquired a character and a good method? I mean, that's absurd. Should we, as they say, just train him in the method and let him figure out the facts himself? That is equally absurd. The essence of education is the accumulation of information about reality. There is nothing else to do or to know. And therefore, the more the better. Definitely. Americans are derogated for being for bigness and quantity, and the bigger is better than the smaller. Well, in this instance, I absolutely agree. The more you teach, other things being equal, the better. But does that mean, therefore, blind memory, intrinsicist dogma, just pouring it in? Absolutely no, because you have to learn by a specific method, and in the act of learning, you are training that method. You are training young minds to use that method. And therefore, you set up a virtuous circle if you do it properly. Every new piece of information improves the child's proficiency in the method of thinking. And every such improvement enables him to grasp new data more efficiently. And that is ideally what you want to set up. The intrinsicist approach is basically the old-fashioned religionist approach. Very often they gave good data, but they never trained minds. What is the extreme example of that in continental Europe with a P? This type of education, where you just stand there, pound, yes, the Prussian approach to education. You just pound it in, the kids have to memorize and spew it back. Now the alternative to that, what is the modern, also with a P in America? The progressive education. And that's simply the subjectivist other side of the coin, according to which reality is irrelevant. The Deweyites say each individual will develop on his own automatically if you just let him alone. He's like a coiled spring, in effect. Just remove the restraints and the prohibitions and the interference of reality, and he will unwind or blossom into creativity. Now that is simply nonsense. The very need of education is precisely that children do not automatically develop. They need a system to bring out or develop their powers. It's not true that the best thing to do is just leave him alone and let him do his own thing. What is the deepest philosophic reason why that is wrong, that approach? He has free will. Right, that's the underlying issue here. Therefore, a mind that has free will has to be trained in correspondence to reality. It has to be educated, molded, taught, shaped, not just left alone to, quote, be itself. So the goal of education is not, quote, freedom, certainly not freedom from reality. It's knowledge, knowledge acquired by a thinking mind. Now, if I can take a quick aside here for parents, what I am saying immediately excludes and refutes the idea of the parents who say, I'm not going to tell my child whether there's a God or not. I'm going to let him decide for himself. I'll send him to church, let him hear the arguments, church or synagogue, and when he's 21, he can make up his mind. Now that, to me, is exactly progressive education. That is a complete abdication of the educational function. And it is the exact analogy of sending a child to a Nazi summer camp or to a mafia conference in order to let him make up his own mind. Why should you inject your, etc.? If you know that something is false, irrational, and harmful, if you know that, it is a complete irresponsibility on your part to say, I'm not going to impose my thought on the child. If so, you have no business bringing the child up at all. Why should you impose your views on 2 and 2 is 4 any more than on any other subject? I am a strong advocate, as I think even my manner of speaking indicates, of a highly directive style of education. And that's one of the points I'm going to be stressing throughout the course. You as teachers and parents have responsibility. You cannot just let your kid be himself. The result is, if you do it properly, he'll have everything because the others will come as a consequence. If you teach him knowledge by the right method, then his character will be in fine shape because if you know the Objectivist Theory of Ethics, the essence of virtue is thinking. And since you make that such a focus, he will develop very well. And he will be an individual. Why? Because the essence of individuality is reliance on your own mind, and you will have trained him how to do that. And he will even have the main prerequisite for being a sociable individual, because that main prerequisite is self-esteem, and that requires reliance on his own reason. So, if I now redefine education on the basis of all this, I would say education by the objective approach. Now, this is already a more specific theory, because I'm applying now an objectivist content to it. Education is the process of training the mind of the young, both in the essential content and the proper method. Process of training the mind of the young, both in the essential content and the proper method. I say essential content because for obvious reasons you can't teach everything. So you've got to pick out something of what mankind knows. Otherwise you could run the entire school from kindergarten to grade school and to university on what's known about worms. Well, this formulation leads us to the question, what is the proper method of human cognition? What's the basic method? And what is the essential content? There is one word in the objectivist philosophy that indicates our answer to both these questions. What is the proper basic method of human cognition, and what determines the essential content that should be taught? And that one word, the key to both of these and to the whole objectivist approach to education, is what? Concepts. Man gains knowledge, once we pass the perceptual level, by the use of concepts. The proper use of concepts is not obvious. That is what, above all, must be learned. That's the human method of cognition. Concepts are a method. Notice. It's a way of what? Organizing data, organizing content. So in the very word concept, you see the false dichotomy between facts versus method. Concepts are organizations of data. It's ways of storing or integrating factual data. If you take the word table, which is a concept, it's a mental symbol that enables you to hold in one mental frame. I don't see one. This one and this one and that one and that one and so on around the world. There is no concepts without data, no thinking without lots of material content. What then would be the essential data that you would want to give a child in education? What is the essential data that a curriculum should include? We're going to have a whole lecture on that, but for now I would say just this much. Whatever data is necessary for the conceptual faculty to develop, whatever factual data is necessary for the conceptual faculty to develop, that's what the curriculum should contain. Some data, for instance, are peripheral. How to drive a car. You might drive or not drive, you can still use your conceptual faculty. But some data are so essential to a functioning conceptual faculty that without it, it can't develop. That's what the school should communicate in content. And, of course, it should communicate the method at the same time. So I'll give you the last reformulation of what is education. The systematic training of the conceptual faculty of the young by means of supplying in essentials both its content and method. The systematic training of the conceptual faculty of the young by means of supplying in essentials both its content and method. The purpose of education is to take a perceptual level creature and train him across many years so that he emerges a mature, cognitively self-sufficient conceptualizer, an informed thinking being. And that is the principle that dictates the curriculum and the instructional method. Now, just to look ahead for a moment, this is going to be very specific. When we get to curriculum, for instance, you do not teach everything. You do not even teach, in my opinion, everything desirable to learn. I'll see why when we get there. It may, for instance, be very nice to play an instrument, or paint, or sculpt. But educationally, these are incomparably less important than reading and writing. Because reading and writing are essential to the conceptual faculty, and the others are very heavily perceptual. If a child knows no music or no art, it will miss a great deal of pleasure and value. But I nevertheless hold that those are peripheral to education. If it does not know reading or writing, its conceptual faculty is crippled at the outset. And this is the method by which I'm going to develop the whole curriculum of a proper education. I'm going to take all the leading candidates and say, of subject matters, from history to Latin, etc., and say, is this subject necessary to the development of a conceptual faculty or not? And the proper curriculum will end up being those bodies of information without which the conceptual faculty can't function. or else can only function in a constricted, seriously impaired way. The method which we're going to also discuss next time will also derive from the nature of conceptualization. How subjects are to be taught will follow from what concepts are and what you have to do to present conceptual material to a child. Looking ahead to that for a moment, you can see that there's one big problem with how people use concepts. One big thing that they have to grasp above all else. And what is that? About concepts. One thing where they're most gravely deficient that has to be learned. The result of which is rationalism, for instance, as one symptom. What is the problem? Floating abstractions, a divorce of concepts from reality. And you know the contempt for ideas that pervades today's culture, the very idea that something is, quote, academic or just theory and so on, all of that. No ism works, ideology is all distorting and so on. So all of that comes from the feeling that concepts have nothing to do with reality. And so today they make a point of avoiding concepts, and you get the phenomena that I indicated in Why Johnny Can't Think. Today, education is in reverse, just like government and art and everything else. What we need to develop is how to train a child in reality-oriented conceptualization. And that's really what an education should be, a systematic process of developing a reality-oriented conceptual faculty. And there are methods of doing it. Now, I would be happy to plunge into the next one, since we have some time, but I'm going to take any questions if there are any. Yes? This is pretty obvious to me so far, so yes? Are you teaching a child values? I'm going to start on that next time. That's one of the subtopics that we will be discussing both next time and the time after, so wait for that till we get there. Yes?
Dr. Peikoff, it seems to me that more elementary even than reading and writing would be language, and beyond reading and writing at this point, what the computer is teaching us in terms of learning logic is also something that's going to fall into this category.
Well, you're already trying to anticipate. When do we teach language? That's a question both of method and of curriculum. And when do we teach logic and how? All of that is next time and the next two times. So try to, for now, not ask me about philosophy of education, but not the method or the content. Yes?
Subjectivism to refer to the branch of philosophy that aligns itself with the teaching of reason and not reality instead of rationalism.
Why would I use subjectivism to refer to that? Because rationalism doesn't necessarily say you should detach your mind from reality. Typically, rationalists believe there's a supernatural realm, like Plato's world of forms, and that when you think conceptually, your mind should relate to that reality. So it would be sort of an unfair characterization to them to say that, although you could argue that it implies subjectivism because they detach concepts from this world, which is the only real world. But subjectivists do that avowedly and directly. They can use the term reason, like Dewey uses intelligence just about every other word. In scientific method, he would be speechless if he wasn't allowed to use those words. But if you ask him what he means by it, it means some process of consciousness not guided by external reality, because he thinks there is no external reality. And consequently, for him, it means consciousness functioning free of any external restraints or contact with reality. And that is the definition of subjectivism. That's why I used it that way. Mark?
Is this a mind-body dichotomy operating here, and does it make any other false dichotomies that sort of line up like theory practice on the one hand? Or?
Yeah, well, you want me to go into the intrinsic versus the subjective. Yes, in a way, this is the reality-reason is a mind-body dichotomy because it's the outer and the inner, if you recall my lectures on understanding objectivism. So this is certainly a form of the mind-body dichotomy, and it certainly lines up with all kinds of other dichotomies, but that'll take us out of the realm of education. There's all kinds of dichotomies that we could have just, 4 lectures on the false dichotomies in education. Like, should education train you in the liberal arts, or should it be practical? Well, that question betrays the idea that the liberal arts are not practical, which comes from the idea that the liberal arts are just manipulating concepts, and what has that got to do with reality? So then they split into the 2 halves, which says, let's train the kid in practicality and to hell with the arts and the humanities, and those who say, let's train the kid in pure theory and to hell with practicality. Let him go to vocational school to learn to read. We're just going to discuss, serious things in school. So that's a nonsensical dichotomy. I would say you should train the kid in the liberal arts, well, certain ones of them. As you'll see, I have a very rigidly exclusive idea of what subject should be taught, and it omits many specialties of people in this room. But that I will leave you to tantalize until the next week. Somebody else in the back on the left there.
Yes, so essentially that's a dichotomy between saying that children should be taught solely concretes versus solely abstractions without any reference to concretes. And you're saying that the proper technique is somewhere in between with the integration of concepts.
I certainly am absolutely saying that. In fact, I haven't quite said that yet. I'm going to be saying that next time in many concrete ways. But I certainly think that the attempt to teach a child abstractions apart from concretes or concretes apart from abstractions is a disaster. And one of the crucial things you have to do is integrate the 2. One of the very crucial. Now, if you are an intrinsicist, you will tend to be a rationalist. And therefore, you will tend to just simply pour broad abstractions into the kid, and you think that'll stand on its own. And if you are a subjectivist, you will tend to be an empiricist, and you will tend to simply give the kid disorganized, concrete-bound projects without any principles. Like in We the Living, when Kira's mother taught at this school, and they were studying shoes. And one class taught how to make shoes, and the other taught how the law of gravity applies to shoes, and the other taught how the capitalist stole the shoes, and so on. So that's this is John Dewey's idea of training minds. See, because you're not bothering with content, you're just giving them little projects so they can develop their intelligence and find what works and what doesn't according to whether the shoes fit or not. Frederick, yes.
If you had to sum it up in just a few words, what would you say John Dewey was most dead set against by proposing this whole philosophy of education?
Reality. I said, what was I say John Dewey is most dead set against in proposing this theory is reality, because the whole thing follows from his Hegelian and Kantianism. John Dewey, I don't want to repeat my whole analysis, which is already in print, but John Dewey is the climax in America of the Kantian idealism. Kantian idealism said the mind creates reality. I think David Kelly mentioned this yesterday. The mind shapes and makes reality whatever it wants. So reality is implicitly malleable. Now, of course, Kant had a true reality which was beyond our grasp, but which we couldn't know. And that quickly atrophied. And all that was left was the reality we shaped. And Dewey and his friends added one gimmick to this. Namely, if the mind shapes reality, why can't we do whatever we want? Why should we be bound by some kind of innate laws of the mind, as Kant thought? If it's we who create reality, we give it, we can take it away. We can do whatever we want. And therefore, let's simply get rid of this idea that there's any restraints on man at all, either external or internal. Whatever you want, try it and see. Sometimes it doesn't work, who knows why? But sometimes it will. Maybe it didn't work till today to leap off the Empire State Building, but next minute it might. So you have to keep revalidating the probabilities, and, et cetera, et cetera. His whole theory comes from that foundation. It's just a logical development of Kant. So it's touch and go. Anybody who's against reality is against reason and vice versa. But there's nothing more fundamental that I know of. His is a perfectly logical, in fact, intelligent theory of education following from German idealism. And was, of course, anticipated in German education party. I'm trying to get different people, but I can't see faces at this distance. Somebody who didn't have their hands up before? Yes.
What arguments could one advance to explain why education should not be compulsory?
That is a separate question. And I'd rather save that one until we get to the political context of education. And I will at that time try to indicate to you, at least briefly, why a certain kind of social, I'm trapped in these wires, why a certain kind of social system is necessary to have the kind of teachers who will provide the kind of education that's appropriate. And I think you can see at that time that compulsory education is incompatible in the long run with the proper type of education, but that does not mean that it's impossible to find a good school today. It's possible, but they have to be in a struggling minority for a short-range period of time. That will be way at the end of the course, at the back, yes.
I was wondering if in a Montessori school, for instance, where my son goes, the teacher would have enough trouble trying to just keep up with the children and not to give detailed reports, for instance, to the parents. So it'd be very difficult for the parents to coordinate with the teacher the type of education that the child was.
So your question is, how would the proper educational system, how would the teacher and the parents coordinate their activities? Well, you'd have to have a teacher that can think and communicate in terms of essentials, but that would be necessary for the teacher to teach properly anyway. The teacher obviously cannot rehearse for the parents each thing he or she is teaching. But what the parent should do properly is watch a couple of classes, see the method that the teacher is using, and have a copy of the syllabus, or find that out. If once you know the general approach and the type of subject matter, it's not too hard for you to know or to project in detail, since you're not ignorant of the subject matter, what the teacher is actually doing. You also have one invaluable source of finding out what your child is getting that does not require you to speak to the teacher. And that is to speak to your child. You know, of course, if you ask your child, what are the corrupt things the teacher did today? That is not the way to get the most objective report. But you can ask, what did you do today? You know, and you can also ask, you know, well, what are you learning? And tell me something you know. How do you spell cat? And you'll find very soon that if you display a sincere interest, that is not the interest of a, quote, parent checking up on his, quote, child, but a human being interested in another human being, what did you actually learn? And so children are very eager, if they're properly taught, to show what they know. And no, they don't hide or pretend. You can find out everything about a school by speaking to a kid. Somebody different, yes.
How does Dewey reconcile having both a socializing and individuating philosophy?
How does Dewey reconcile both socializing and individuating? There are no absolutes. As I was taught in graduate school by a leading follower of John Dewey, and he always used to say, the trouble with you, Peikoff, is that you're a monist. And a monist, you know, monist is from the word mono, meaning one. A monist is a oneist. Monist is somebody who says that in any field there is one principle, like ethics, life is the standard. Education, concepts are the standard, and so on. And he used to say, this is ridiculous. There are many desirable things in life. It's desirable to be social, it's desirable to be an individual, it's desirable to be moral, and sometimes it's desirable to be immoral. And there's, you know, all kinds of things are desirable, and then it's just a question of, you know, you put them together intelligently. And so that was the question of, what is intelligent? How do you know when to be social and when to be an individual? You judge by the situation. How do you know within any situation? An intelligent man knows it. It just goes round and round. There is no answer. He says, sometimes he used to say, you can't be skeptical. You can't keep asking, how do you know? Some things are obvious. So some things are obvious. And yet there are no absolutes, so the thing that's obvious might be wrong in the next second. It's, you know, it's just a whirling Heraclitean flux. That's all it is. And that's exactly what the schools are. I'm trying to get only new people in the last few minutes, so don't ask if you've already asked. I'm sure you have. Yes?
Which of these schools would David Hume advocate, in your opinion, and why?
Well, I don't know that Hume had any theory of education. Let's go down and see. This is now an exercise in rationalistic deduction, because he certainly couldn't advocate factual knowledge because there aren't any. There isn't any. He's a skeptic. He couldn't advocate the methodology of rationality because he believed that we are doomed to be irrational by our nature, since reason is a helpless faculty. He might advocate obeying your emotions or society's injunctions, if that's what he defined as morality, because we had nothing to do but follow our instincts or our arbitrary desires, if he wanted to call that morality, as he sometimes suggested, and as his later logical positivists suggested. He might advocate being an individual if he lived in an individualistic society, and he interpreted individualism as pure subjectivism. Or he might advocate socializing if he took a Deweyan type of view, that none of us can know anything, but we have to get along with others. So it would probably be some subjectivist version within there. But I mean, it's hard to predict. If a man says there is no way to know anything, if someone believes that he is a sliced cucumber salad that's open to discussion, go and infer from that what his theory of education is. Yes.
There's been a lot of talk of educational reform lately. Is the educational establishment genuinely questioning the principles and methods it's been teaching?
Is the educational establishment genuinely questioning the principles it's been using? Well, I'd have to say no. There are people who are questioning some of the things, and sometimes with relatively surprising results. For instance, Albert Shanker, who is quite a decent guy for a labor leader, he's the head of one of the teachers' unions, has come out recently in favor of merit pay. Has come out for the idea that teachers should be paid more if they're good teachers, which caused a big stir in union circles. Now, he did it, not on philosophic grounds, but he was bowing to public pressure. Nevertheless, he did it. And that, within his framework, is pretty revolutionary. So on that level, there are people trying to find out what's wrong, and they generally know that it's a disgrace to the system. But the problem is, on a fundamental level, it's all for nothing, because the idea of a merit teacher, as opposed to an ordinary one, is one that teaches you to socialize better than the ordinary one. In other words, the whole philosophic approach to education is so non- or anti-conceptual that their questioning doesn't really lead anywhere. So the only really genuinely significant challenge would be to make education conceptual in the way I've indicated it. I don't know I haven't the faintest indication that any one commission, government body, Carnegie Group, teacher, or union, or bureaucracy is taking a step in that direction. Oh, no, I'll just correct one thing. There are some very interesting experiments being done right now in writing, in teaching kids writing, which I'll try to mention a couple periods from now, which is to me a one hopeful sign on the horizon. Okay, I guess we could take one or two more. All right, yeah.
Dr. Peikoff, it strikes me in your philosophy of education that moral training is going to have to go, sounds like it goes hand in hand with your conceptual training, since reason and honesty are moral concepts, and that simultaneously you're going to be developing the person morally as well as developing their mental.
Yeah, you say that by what I've said, you're going to be simultaneously developing the person morally if you develop him in the intellectual ways that I indicated, because after all, morality for objectivism is a product of a certain kind of intellectual thinking approach, and that is certainly true. I'll be developing that point. But it is true, just to anticipate, I do not believe that you should sit down with the child at any age. I'm really taking this out of a later point, so I'll just say it briefly here. I do not think you should sit down with a child and say, now I'm Randy Schoen, and life is a standard of value. And this involves egoism and rationality, independence, integrity. Give them a list of virtues and so on. That is not the way to teach values, or virtues, or morality. I think you do it in many, many concrete and indirect ways, so that by the time he reaches a certain age, maybe mid-teens or later, he already has all of the data and all of the foundation, and at that point, there's no problem. It's in how you, in the act, as you'll see, of teaching, the right method and the right content, that combination, you are inherently teaching the right values. Not by teaching values as such, but by teaching the right content by the right method. In many, many, many ways, you give the child integrity, you give them the message of the value of integrity, independence, honesty, productiveness, justice, egoism, self-reliance, all of it, not as lecturing, but by the way you teach mathematics, etc., and so on. Believe it or not, you teach ethics by teaching subject matter. You know, the despised factual knowledge that everybody thinks we don't want to clutter our children's mind up like this. We have apparently time for one question. Is that correct, George? Two questions. Okay. In the center, yes.
In your talk on why Johnny can't think, you had indicated that you thought teachers' colleges should pretty much be closed down. Was your opinion based on the fact that the philosophy of education taught at the teachers' colleges?
No. Well, I'm going to defer that until that's one of the topics I want to discuss in the last class. Why I think teachers' colleges should be closed down. I got a lot of mail on that from graduates of teachers' colleges. And some strongly agreed, and some were very upset. And I got objections, very vehement objections, such as, for instance, you yourself spend a lot of time teaching how to communicate and how to present ideas and how to teach. You're giving a whole course on it. How can you say that we shouldn't have a school? So therefore, they say, you can say we want to have a better school of education, but how can you say there should be no school? And I will answer that at the end of this course. One last question that doesn't pertain to anything else. Are you new? Yes, okay.
Yeah. You said that one is educated until one is mature, that beyond that point one can learn facts, but cannot be educated.
Oh, unless you need remedial training, yeah.
Yes. Are you assuming then that there's a point beyond which one can't learn methodology?
Basic methodology, yes, I am assuming that. There is a point, basic methodology, by which you either have it or you don't. At a certain point, you have to be able to say, I am able to think, I can perceive reality, I have a grasp of certain crucial subjects, I know where I am mentally, I'm in charge of my mind. Now, you can always go on developing more knowledge. You can always go on refining method, refining details of method. But the principles in a proper educational system, I would say 16 tops. By the time you're 16, you should be completely self-sufficient intellectually. You should know how to think, and you should have all the fundamentals in the crucial subjects. And then it's just a matter of expanding as you wish. Now today, of course, they don't get it by 35. Because they're not taught it. But definitely there's a cutoff point. I do not believe education is lifelong in that sense. Individual pieces of information, but education is this basic preparatory process. And at a certain point, you should have the temerity to say, I have been educated. That's it. I'm finished now. Okay, with that, we'll close till next time.